for coming today. My name is Steven Siciliano. I am the president of the board of directors at the Traverse Area Historical Society. And as we have a number of visitors today, I'd like to just give a quick overview of our organization. We are a nonprofit 501c3, and our mission is to preserve, protect, and present the history of the Grand Traverse region. Activities include programs, historical tours, archive support, scholarship support, and support of local initiatives to preserve our local history. We are an all-volunteer organization and governed by a board of directors, and we meet monthly upstairs here in the library. Revenues from memberships and donations are what helps to fund events like this one today. Today's presentation is entitled Clues, Tidbits, and Surprises in Researching Leelanau History. Our presenter is Kim Kelderhouse, Executive Director of the Leelanau Historical Society. During her presentation, Kim will share unique stories and discoveries from her 11 years working for the Leelanau Historical Society. Kim is a descendant of Thomas P. Kelderhouse, one of the very first settlers of Port Oneida. Her passion for history stems from her own personal connections to Leelanau's past, but has grown to encompass the interconnection of the Grand Traverse region. We are also broadcasting today on Zoom. So please welcome Kim Kelderhouse.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's so nice to see familiar faces and new faces. This presentation concept I've kind of stole from some fellow historian friends, Tom and Chris. Probably a lot of people know them as well, Chris Byron and Tom Wilson. They did a similar presentation, but talked about Michigan history, and I thought I can do that with Leelanau history. And so here we are today. I'm so happy the Traverse City Historical Society reached out and said, "Hey, can you do a presentation?" And I said, "This is the moment for this presentation." As Stephen mentioned, I've worked for the Leelanau Historical Society for 11 years. I started there as the museum assistant, and in 2020 became the executive director. So I've worked at all levels of the museum, greeting people, all the way up now to doing budgets and working with the board. And it's all fun, but at the core, it's always that history, these stories, and the connections with the living descendants and that kind of thing that really keeps my passion for history going. And I have to thank the History Center of Traverse City for kind of igniting that. I was an intern there back in 2012, and that really started my path down this career. I never planned to end up here, but having that internship and then seeing a little job notice for a museum assistant at the Leelanau Historical Society, I started there and never looked back. So it's a wonderful community, like I said, across the Grand Traverse region, all of the different historical societies and small town museums. That community is just so wonderful. So I encourage people to visit and patronize all of the other organizations in the area. But without further ado, let's get started. Since some of you are new, this is our facility, the Leelanau Historical Society. So we do have a museum and archives there. So mentioning visiting, please come up and visit us too. We're open Wednesday through Friday in the wintertime. So we do a lot of different programs there, and one of which is some cemetery restoration work. And this kind of leads me to my first topic, and some words that a fellow historian, Andrew White, said in a recent project. He said, "History is written by those who stayed." And that is so true. There are so many names of people and families that we don't really recognize because they moved on. They left the area, and their descendants aren't necessarily keeping their stories vibrant. So when we were working at the East Leland Cemetery, we discovered a number of markers for the Timblin family. And they had quite the story to tell. Thanks to the digital newspaper archives at CMU, we were able to piece together their family story and why they ended up leaving. There were some early deaths and some conflict about inheritance, and ultimately the living children moved on because of issues with the other neighbors and other families that were living there. But it's really important to keep these markers standing. So we've been working on that not only for the Timlin family, but for families across Leelanau County, and that kind of work is so meaningful to find these graves. Another family that didn't stay and is another recent project is the Levi and Anna Johnson family. They were African American homesteaders. They were freed slaves who ended up coming to Empire. They claimed their land through the Homestead Act, and you can see them. I can see the mouse here. Levi Johnson's property is down here where I'm circling. You can see the little square for his home site. This is the 1880 plat map of Leelanau County. This is right across from the Pierce Stocking Drive. There's a trail there called the Windy Moraine Trail, and you can walk that trail and actually see the clearing in the woods and some old apple trees, and that is the Levi Johnson homestead. The Leelanau Historical Society offers a fellowship to historians to conduct history work. And one of those was Kevin Brooks, or is Kevin Brooks. Kevin has been documenting his own family's history, who were neighbors of the Johnsons. And he uncovered this incredible story related to the Johnsons and his family. Anna Johnson, or helped care for his ancestors when their mother passed away. And Kevin decided to find descendants of the Johnsons. They weren't in the area, and he started hunting and finally discovered them in Pittsburgh. He reached out through Facebook Messenger, and at first they were a little hesitant. They were like, "Who is this man? He lives in Michigan. He says he knows who our family is." But this story has blossomed. The family now, the Johnson descendants, a couple of them have now visited twice to northern Michigan, and we've been working to document this story with a documentary film. So we've got about a 40-minute film that will be released later this year. But again, this goes back to that story of history is written by those who stayed. The Johnsons, we have a few photos in the Empire Historical Museum. And so we knew they were here, but we didn't know the full scope of the story until people like Kevin really started digging deeper to discover that. And making that connection for the Johnson descendants back to their roots was so incredibly meaningful. I got to participate in visiting the courthouse and the probate court with them, and seeing that record of them owning property was so touching for descendants of freed slaves. Seeing a document that shared that their ancestors owned property in northern Michigan, it was so incredibly moving. Um, so keep that in mind when you're doing your own history research of, we know about the Perry Hannahs, we know about, Mr. Dr. Munson, all of those people who stuck around and whose names are on the buildings and the places here. But there's families like the Timblins and the Johnsons who also have these great stories to tell. So this kind of goes back to our core. So everybody's, I would, or I can imagine a lot of you have heard Leelanau County means land of delight. It's a translation from, an Indian word that means land of delight. Now, if you really sit with that and think about it, why would a Native community have a word for land of delight? Like, would delight have even been, it's a pretty English word to think about. And so there's a historian named Elliot Singer, a folklorist actually, who has done a little digging, and he has actually come to the conclusion that it is not a Native American word. Leelanau sounds very, kind of has those intonations that sound native, but in fact it is not. It was the pen name for Jane Schoolcraft. Jane is the wife of Henry Schoolcraft, who was the Indian agent for much of northern Michigan. He was tasked with having relationships with the Native people in this area. And he also learned the languages of this area really well, which allowed him to make up words that sounded Native American. And so he was also in charge of recommending names for counties. So in 1829, he recommended the names for a bunch of counties. There's even one he named for himself, Schoolcraft County, and Leelanau was one of them. And Elliot Singer believes that it was in honor of his wife's pen name. She was one of the first Native American poets, and she was Native American. So her mother was Native, her father was Scots-Irish, but it was still a made-up name. So it's a little demystifying of that Leelanau name, but I think it's even more interesting of a story. And her poetry is beautiful. Her name, and I'm not going to try to say it right now because I will butcher it in her, native language. But the translation is the woman of like the falling stars. It's just a beautiful name, and I bet the library here might have. There is a book with a lot of her poetry and telling her life story. Um, So another incredible figure in Leelanau history, and this is one of the interesting things. I don't know, maybe other historians can relate to this, but I feel like I start to get to know some of these people. So Orange Risden, I talk about Orange Risden a lot. He did the first accurate survey of Leelanau County. There were a few surveys before his, but he was essentially rehired to resurvey certain areas that were not done well enough. And so we are often referencing Orange's survey. And so this is the excerpt from Leland right there. And the one thing that he did really special was he marked Native American sites on there. And I don't know if we can get close enough, but up here near Leland, he marked out gardens and encampment sites. Down near Glen Arbor, he marked where there was evidence of maple syrup tapping, and this wasn't something commonly done across the state. He surveyed other counties in the state, and he didn't necessarily do this for those. So, what moved him to do that here in Leelanau County? I don't know. But it's such great historical data for us historians who want to know more about those first people that were on this land. And I just imagine too going back in time. So he was doing this survey in 1850, and this was necessary across the state in order for that land to be sold to people. The government had to survey first, and then they could sell the land. Um, and just bushwhacking across Leelanau County, old growth timber and trees and swamps, and he had a whole crew of people with him, and they were doing the surveying the old way, chains, and they're carrying these heavy chains through the woods, and how incredible. So really got to thank him, and he even documented the names of the villages and the names of the chiefs. Um, that was just, it's fascinating to look at his original survey notes, and they have a lot of character in them. The original survey notes, little tidbits here and there. So one of my favorite tidbits is for Sleeping Bear. He said, bared sand drifts and bluff hills from 50 to 300 feet high, worthless. So this is an 1850 surveyor. His biggest interest is agricultural land, timberland, access to water for, hydropower, those kinds of things. And so he saw Sleeping Bear Dunes and went, oh my gosh, what would anybody do with this? It's worthless. Now we all laugh because we all know now Sleeping Bear Dunes is a huge economic driver for our area. And I always love to use that example with school kids because it's so perfect contrast and just that change in mindset from timber and agriculture to modern day and tourism. Those things still matter for sure, but we have this wonderful and sometimes not so wonderful thing called tourism. So another great thing about Orange's survey is that he surveyed before the dam in Leland went in. The number one thing I have been asked since working at the Historical Society is, now I've heard that Lake Leelanau was just a river before the dam went in. And I'm always like, no, no, definitely not. And thankfully, I have this wonderful document from Orange. So the dam went in 1853. He was doing his survey in 1850. So we can see just from this image here of Leland how similar things look. Now, it certainly impacted things. It certainly raised water levels. Some lower lying areas certainly did grow, but it was not a river by any means, even if I should have added the southern part of the lake too. But since kind of looking at this and then talking to some geologists and hydrogeologists, they also confirm the Native American people were likely damming the river in certain ways, putting in fish ladders. Wildlife and beavers were putting in fish ladders, different environmental factors, drought and heavy rain would have stabilized Lake Leelanau essentially similar to we see it now. And so that kind of explains why the dam didn't have, as much of an impact as you might think. And it's certainly, you can, if anybody's visited Fishtown lately, you can see that from this first iteration of the dam, it looks a lot different. Um, and we go into further detail about that in a documentary film that we worked on last summer. We won a state history award for it, and we will be screening it at the Alluvian. I heard from a lot of you today that you really liked that I was here in Traverse City. So we're trying to bring, we know a lot of Leelanau people come to live in Traverse City for various reasons. And so we're trying to do more programming in Traverse City as well. So North Manitou Island. There's been a lot of interest. If anybody's read the news lately, you've heard about the docks over there and the things that Sleeping Bear is proposing to do over the next 2 to 5 years. But from a historical standpoint, we've been really lucky to see some incredible photo collections become available in the last couple years. One of which was a book published earlier this year about Crescent. That's the logging village over here on this side of the island. The family who descended from the original managers of that logging operation had this incredible photo collection, and they knew who a lot of the people were, the crews that were working there, and they told that entire story in their book. The other photo collection that became available this last year is one that I knew had to be out there. I'd seen prints of Fred Samuelson's photos. Fred Samuelson was one of the lighthouse keepers at the lighthouse on North Manitou, which again is kind of special. People go, "Oh, there was a lighthouse on North Manitou." There was a lighthouse on North Manitou. It was a square tower, and it was eventually closed when the crib opened, the Shoal Lighthouse out in the water, and then just abandoned. And so, due to erosion on this point, what's called Dimmock's Point, it eventually fell into the lake. So I always knew Fred Samuelson, and he's another one that I'm like, "Ah, I feel like I know him." You look at some of his photos and just the way he was capturing stuff. He had an eye. He was an artist. He wasn't just a lighthouse keeper. He had an artistic eye for photography, and I knew his photos had to be out there somewhere. And we were approached by a donor who said, "I have these 50 glass plate negatives. They're North Manitou Island," and I was immediately like, "That's the era of Fred's photography." And sure enough, they are Fred Samuelson's photos. I still believe there's more out there though. But just if you really study these photos, this one woman, she's got a portrait in her hand. She's got the little hanky. They're so beautifully dressed up. Like I want to know the full story. And there's not a lot of detail with the negatives. That's many of them do have dates though, which is pretty incredible to have a date to go with these. But we don't know the story behind why they decided to get dressed up and pose like that. There's a whole series of these women. You can tell it's the same day. They're all in the same outfits. And then this photo is really neat because you can see back here these little picket fences. This has got to be the cemetery on the island. And the cemetery, one of the cemeteries was moved at one point. So it kind of begs the question, which cemetery is this? Why did they decide to, oh, it keeps advancing, take a photo in the cemetery? They definitely were thinking about it. This gentleman's got like a butchered chicken over here. Um, but yeah, I was just so excited to see those Fred Samuelson photos. And so those are part of the Leelanau Historical Society collection now. We scanned all those glass plate negatives in, and they just fill in this really interesting gap in time. So many people think about this wilderness island and don't expect to see women like this, dressed like this on a wilderness island. North Manitou had quite the agricultural community and tourist community at one point. They had a cottage row there that was mostly Chicago people coming to vacation for the entire summer. They were enjoying the beautiful clean air of northern Michigan and had these wonderful little cottages, and one of which might even be designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So there's just all these fascinating connections to North Manitou. So, onto this document. Um, this is, it translates to the crime in Isidore. So, some people are familiar with the murder of the nun that occurred at the church in Isidore. Um, this was the Polish community that lived there was all mostly spoke Polish still. That was still their native tongue. And so they were a little distrusting of the reports that were coming from the English speaking journalists and things at the time. And so they hired a Polish native out of Chicago to come up and attend all of the court hearings and essentially write uh, the story of what was happening for them to read in their native language. We received the gift of these books probably about 10 years ago, I think. Might have been more than 10 years ago. And for a while, they just sat because we were like, they're in Polish. I don't know who would want to spend the time translating them. About 5 years ago, we made connection with a gentleman who spoke a number of Eastern European languages. And during COVID, during the stay at home order, he needed a project, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have the perfect project, because he was coming into the museum and he was looking at old Bibles and telling me, oh, this is a German Bible, this is a Polish Bible, little projects like that. He wasn't doing full on translations for us. But once he was stuck at home, I said, well, I've got these booklets about the crime in Isidore. And so he sat down. His name is David Beatty at home, and he says that it was his way he got through the stay at home order. He's enjoys being busy, and this gave him something to do. And um, there if you read through the translations, it's very interesting. And at a certain point, the author tries to like draw you in further by introducing this like side love story. Like I think the crime stuff was getting a little like slow and that kind of thing. So it's kind of written like a true crime in some ways, but then you get this little side story. Um, so we're still trying to figure out a way to publish this. I'd love to do it, side by side, because the other cool thing is there's a lot of photos in amongst it of the people involved. This one is interesting. This is the jury, but they intentionally kind of did it dark so you couldn't see their faces, but we do know who they are. So you can see he just did it in Google Docs and went page by page. Um, but fascinating. And it seems like a lot of people connect back to this. If you read that juror list, I meet people very often who are like, oh, my great grandpa was a juror for that. And I recently met the one of the prosecuting attorneys. So the prosecuting attorney in Leelanau County was new at the time. And so they had a co-prosecutor come from Traverse City. And I met the descendant recently, and I'm blanking on the name of that individual, but the descendant of that person that was from Traverse City. And she's working on a history of her grandfather's cases that included this one. So I got an email with a photo of this sewing machine from the Bailey family. And they said, oh, Grandpa always said it was from the Palmer family. We, had some of their barn, I believe it was that they had, and it was left in the barn. And I was like, oh, okay, we've got a couple other sewing machines, and this is, collections people having to decide, do we take this sewing machine? We've got, two other sewing machines. What's special about this one? And it dawned on me, we have the diaries from one of the Palmer women. And I thought, wow, what are the chances? What are the chances she mentions her sewing machine? Well, the chances turned out to be 100%. Sarah Palmer did, in fact, mention this exact sewing machine. This is the full entry, but I'm just going to read the bold there. So this is from 1890. Melville went over to the dock and got my sewing machine from Mrs. McMullen sent me, which was her mother's. The name is Jenny June. So I replied to the Baileys, and I was like, what kind of sewing machine is it? And they said, a Jenny June. And I feel pretty certain that this is Sarah Palmer's sewing machine. So that photo there, we have it in our museum now. And Sarah's diaries are a really wonderful snapshot of Sutton's Bay history at the time. You can kind of see she talks about the weather. A dull day looks like a storm. When she says went down to the dock, she's talking about the dock in Sutton's Bay. Um, Things like that came on big boats at the time. Um, so she just, for many years, was capturing her daily life. And we don't have a lot of diaries in our collection, but diaries are so special to historical collections because they give that very real snapshot into people's lives, what they were cooking and growing and doing, and serve as primary source documents to confirm artifacts like that one. So a lot of people have seen this little icon. I'm a sugar loafer, and we just finished up and debuted this summer an exhibit about sugarloaf. It's been really great. It's been so fun to meet people. It's been so fun to do an exhibit that's still in living memory. All of the other exhibits I've worked on have not necessarily been in living memory of people. And so, confirming, odd tidbits of history can be challenging with those types of exhibits, but this one was really fun because there's often somebody to track down and be like, "Do you remember when? Do you have a photo of this?" Um, but this was one thing that just kept bugging me. I love this little cartoon, and there's a version of this for the golf course as well, where he's got golf clubs, lesser known. Um, but in the back of my mind, I was like, "Who drew this? Who was the artist?" Because this is all over the place. This is the iconic Sugarloaf. Everybody knows this is Sugarloaf. And we had an intern working for us this last summer, and she was doing a lot of networking through the Friends of Sugarloaf page. And she finally got a message and said, "Well, that was my grandma. My grandma made did that." And they gave us the name, and it was Mary Dorman. Turns out Mary Dorman was worked for Hallmark pretty early on. She was writing all kinds of greetings. She was involved with the creation of the first three-dimensional card, and she worked at Sugarloaf in the marketing department when marketing was all hand drawn, ads and things. It wasn't computer graphic design, and that I think for me was one of the coolest discoveries or findings from that exhibit was to finally like give that artist, her credit, finally. So that was a little newspaper clipping we found of a photo. We didn't find any other great photos, but that newspaper one was something at least. So this is the wreck of the Rising Sun. I know the Traverse City or the collection here has some photos of it as well. The Rising Sun was a ship that was owned by the Israelite House of David out of Benton Harbor. They had some gardens up on High Island. There's Garden Island up there too. So I'm like, wait, Garden or High? I think it was High Island. And they were returning with their harvest down to Benton Harbor, and they wrecked off of Pyramid Point. And this story is not at all about them, but it turns out that they had this incredible photo collection that they initially thought maybe had something to do with insurance purposes, that the insurance person came and photographed the wreck in order to claim insurance. But then there's one photo, and we were at a conference not this last October, but over a year ago, October now. And I was sitting in one of the sessions, and I turned back and saw one of the archivists from the House of David. And I was like, "Oh, those Rising Sun photos you guys just released, they're so incredible. They're so great. I have a personal connection to Port Oneida. Just thank you. Thank you for, sharing those." And she said, "Yeah, there's this photo of a house. We're not really sure how it's connected or if it's connected." And I was like, "Well, I know a lot of Port Oneida people. Maybe it's one of the Port Oneida houses where some of the survivors went and stayed." Um, and she sent the photo over a couple weeks later. And I initially looked at it and was like, "I don't know. I don't think so." And then I sent it to a couple other Port Oneida historians, and rather quickly got a response and said, "Deco Farm." Um, So this house is still standing, pretty different. The porch has been removed, and that kind of thing. And it would have been taken not too long after it was built. Now that we based on the people in the photo, I do believe the woman passed away from the Deco family, and but just such a cool photo. Why it's in amongst those, we're not sure, because I emailed back and said, "Oh, so I just want to double check insurance photos," and she was like, "Oh, no, no, that was just a speculation at one time. We're really not sure." You know, they wanted to document the shipwreck. Someone did, obviously, but not really sure why that deco photo is in there. But they were so pleased to have an identification. And and I'm so glad that so many times in historical organizations you have photos that you don't know, and sometimes you release them because you're like, we can't keep holding on to these. Well, I'm so glad they kept holding on to this one and that we were able to provide an identification, and get that. And it's the more you study the image, the more you see. You can see that orchard in the background, that really neat car there. The granary and the barn buildings are also still standing. Um, I'm pretty sure we also could tell that the clothesline is still in the same spot. Just really neat things about that image. So this is my family home in Port Oneida. Now that we're on the Port Oneida subject matter, I'm always kind of passively documenting my own family history and keeping an eye out for things in our collection. It's shocking how many times I find photos in our collection that are of my ancestors. Um, and Probably about 5 years ago, a gentleman came in and said, "I've got some photos. My family was one of them was a traveling minister, and he came to the Port Oneida Sleeping Bear area, and he pulled out this stack of postcards, and I start looking through, and sure enough, there's my family's home. Never seen photos of it like this. This must have been pretty early, with such a elaborate paint scheme. Um, I've only ever seen it kind of whitewashed and very simple. And that's the traveling minister posing with my great great grandparents, and I'm not sure which of their children it is. And also, the first image I've ever seen of the Port Oneida dock. Now these pictures are probably about 1917 or 18. So this was really after the heyday of the dock. So it's more of a dock in disrepair. But some of those pilings are still there, out in the water. But yeah, that's always been one of my the unicorns I've been looking for in a collection, is a photo of the Port Oneida dock. We have so many pictures of all the other docks around Leelanau County, but that's one that I've never really seen a photo of. Even in those rising sun images, I'm like, sure, they've got to get the dock, a little bit of the dock near in the background of one of those photos. But nope, nope. But this is that first one that I've ever seen. And again, so thankful that this family, no real deep connections to Leelanau County, thought to bring those back to our area and connect. That was a really goosebumps moment to see those photos. So I just wanted to end on this one. There are so many fun things you can find in the newspapers, and for a long time we used to have to look at the newspapers by hand very carefully because that's all we had was the originals. But not too long ago, we had most of them. 90% of them digitized through CMU, so they're fun to keyword search. Also included the Grand Traverse Herald because it predates the Leelanau Enterprise and documents a lot of Leelanau history, but obviously a lot more Traverse City history. So please hop on and take a look at that. But one of my favorite little findings was this entry from after Thanksgiving. There will be no more foul proceedings until Christmas time, so turkeys may feel reasonably sure of their heads till then. Um, every editor of the Leelanau Enterprise had some, interesting quirks that they did. And I can't remember who was the editor at this time, but they always had these fun little quips. And that is just one of the seasonal ones that I always find so fun. Um, well, that concludes things. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer questions.
Hi, Kim. I'm wondering exactly where the Port Oneida dock was.
Yeah, do I have a good map that would have, no, I had a few maps in here. Yeah, it's, so if you, the intersection, so Port Oneida Road and Lane Road is the first road that comes off. If where those two kind of split, if it continued at a diagonal across that field. Yes, yeah, that's where the dock was where the town of Port Oneida was. So, and out in the middle of that field, you see there's a huge stand of lilacs. That was where the original Thomas Kelderhouse home was, which was not too far from the village. And if you do walk the beach in that area, you will find a dug away along the bluff, and that's where they historically had the ramp up to the village and the general store and the hotel and that kind of things. Yeah.
Looks like the names of Glen Lake and Lake Leelanau were different.
Yes.
Over
Yeah. So Lake Leelanau is a fun one. So it was originally Carp Lake, and it was in 1905 that the Leelanau County Board of Commissioners decided to change it. They said it was a misnomer that didn't reflect the beauty of the area. So, and it was called Carp Lake because pre-dam, the native carp fish would have gone up the river and into the lake. So that one was pretty simple. And then Glen Lake was Bear Lake, so for sleeping bear. So trying to find the native name for things too. We asked around quite a bit before we did our Lake Leelanau documentary. And there is one map that refers to Lake Leelanau as Lac de la Loupe, like French, Lake of the Wolf. But there's not much context to that, like why, we don't necessarily think of this part of Michigan having wolves. So that one I'm still trying to find. But many of the Native historians that we asked, presently were kind of was like, no, can't remember anything, specific. That would have been different than, Carp Lake and Lake Leelanau.
Thank you.
But yeah, there were a lot of carp lakes in Michigan. There are a lot of bear lakes in Michigan. So I can also see from that perspective, changing and differentiating. And I'm not sure when Glen Lake was changed.
Spell the name of the surveyor.
Yeah, orange like the fruit, and then Risdon, Risdon.
D-O-N. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about him. Can you find the slide
Yeah.
where he has this picture? Do you have any idea how old he is in that picture? And was that when he was doing the surveying, or is it an older,
I have a feeling it's an older picture. I got that from the Leelanau Historical Society because that was his hometown. And there's actually, I don't know if there's many pictures of him. It looks like they actually have a statue, kind of like our Perry Hanna statue of him. And it looks like they used this photo as the reference if you look at that. And they dress him up just like Perry Hanna gets dressed up. I was kind of like, oh, what a fun little connection when I was grabbing this photo. I didn't realize there was that sculpture, but yeah, he was from down in Saline, Michigan.
looking at him and trying to think of
Yeah.
him like walking, slashing through and I'm like, looks
gonna-
like maybe he was a little younger.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look that up now that you've asked that and see how old he was when he was doing that. One of the other fun entries, and I still haven't gotten to the bottom of it, there was some little note about saying they lost someone over by Glen Arbor. And what I can't figure out is if it meant like they just temporarily lost that person or like permanently lost that person, or it kind of sounded like maybe they found like a grave, like and he was reiterating. And I still haven't gotten to the bottom of that one, but there's so many interesting little tidbits in those survey notes, and it's all written in this script, just like you see, actually probably less nice because this is, this was his final map. So his notes are less neat. So they can be a lot to wade through, but we found like the entries for, Sugarloaf and doing that Sugarloaf exhibit. I wanted to see, what he recorded about Sugarloaf because it's, it is such a big hill. Was there anything interesting that he recorded there or that kind of thing? But just neat to look through. And all these like written across are the types of trees that are there and the soil types.
How do you handle discrepancies between the stories, the family histories from descendants and from the historical record?
Yeah, carefully. I always try to, wait until you have, some sort of smoking gun, and then you let that document or that piece of evidence speak for itself. And, just talking about the story of how we do history, it's gotten better. Documents are digitized every day. Our understanding of, the language and translations and stuff gets better and better. There's a lot of factors at play. So just talking about, people, the historians at the time were doing the best they could, and now we're doing the best we can. And sometimes our best is more accurate than their best. And that happens, more often than you might think. And it's happened amongst my own family too. I'm also a Plamondan, and my grandma's brother passed away during World War II, and the family lore was he died on the beaches of Normandy. I got an email in August from a historian group working out of Europe to document his battalion, and they said he actually survived the invasion of Normandy. And died a few weeks later in a town in France during Operation Cobra, I think it was called. So that was like, I was like, Mom, how do we tell Grandma? Like, because that was deeply, she was a young girl. I think she was 12 at the time. But knowing the truth is also really, beautiful, even if it's different than what you thought it was. And, who knows what'll happen now? Maybe we'll go visit that town because apparently they have a monument for the battalion and everything. And I don't know. It's another great historian said, don't stop looking for, or when you stop looking for, not phrasing this right. When you only look for the first and the last, or when you think you've found the first and the last, you probably haven't. And so things we often say, oh, he was the first settler, or the first this, or the first that, or the last this, or the last that. And when we start to do that, it stops us from looking further. So I always try to use things like one of the first, one of the last, because it leaves open that possibility that there might be somebody else.
Jim, in that photo of the dam in Leland, there's some background buildings. I'm just wondering if it looks kind of interesting. I'm not sure what that is. It looks like it's a larger building off to the left.
Yeah, so
Church.
yeah, well, I think this building behind the woman standing is likely like the early bird area.
Yeah,
So this wouldn't have been like right when the dam was built. So this was probably years later.
Early birds there area.
It's a name of a restaurant that still stands, but it's yeah, kind of. Most of the locals still call it the Early Bird because that was the restaurant that was there the longest. Now it's like the Traverse City Chocolate Company. A little brick building right on the kind of river in Maine is the intersection Leland. So the Mercantile, the Early Bird building, what was the candy store, everybody kind of knows it as the candy shop, and then the Harbor House building. So kind of the main intersection of Leland where you turn to go down to Fishtown. I think that's what we're seeing. Those buildings are probably on that intersection of River and Main. Yes.
You still have the Sugarloaf exhibit set up in the historical society?
Yes, yep, that will be open through next summer, yeah. Yes.
How do you feel about using newspapers as primary sources?
It can be tricky. Cause yeah, certainly I think we all know newspapers even today get things wrong. And so I always try to remind myself of that, but they are still one of, the better resources that we have. They certainly give a snapshot in time too of like generally the activities going on. But cross-referencing them with other sources helps confirm that. I don't know if I've had an instance where like a historic newspaper entry really differed too much. I think the biggest thing is just dates can get muddled up because of how the correspondence system for the papers worked then. It's not like now where you can send an email or make a phone call really quickly and immediately it goes in the paper. Sometimes, an event would occur and then it would be days before the entry would be in the paper, and sometimes what they would enter as the date of someone's death or something might be a day or two off. But the core information for the most part, I've at least with the Leelanau papers that I've worked with, has been fairly accurate, but those dates certainly can get muddled with how they were communicating that to the paper. Mhm.
So can you go back to that photo on North Manitou and the horses have, yes, like a blanket. It
Mhm.
kind of looks like it could have been a hearse or something, if they had something in the middle, or just wondered
Yeah,
what was
that's
going on.
that's certainly possible. Yeah, I don't know. That's why these images are so fascinating. There were about 50 of them. Some are just, scenic landscape shots, and it's just a great reference for the buildings and things, but some, especially the ones with the people, just you want to know that story that was happening that day. Yeah, well, they seem to have like a whole harvest of things there on that wagon. Um, yeah.
Please again, help me thank Kimberly. Thank you so much. Dan. I'd like to invite you to refreshments afterwards and further conversation. So thank you all again for coming.